All right, without further ado, for the first time ever, please welcome to the stage Sam Harris and Brian Greene.
Pretty sure there was another universe where we didn't almost fall on the stage. When
we falling victim to gravity so early, in the conversation.
So, thank you all for coming. Really, it's again, I've said this at many events, but it's no less true at this one. It's just amazing to put a date on the calendar and show up in a theater and have all of you come out. It's an immense privilege, and thank you for coming out. Lift weights in order to pour your water, Brian.
Wow. Yeah. Thank you.
So I think we're going to start, kind of a natural place to start is just to talk about what do we think we know and why we think we know it. I think, from and then ultimately why any of that matters, why being right or wrong or close enough matters. For me, it's coming from more of a life science and philosophy of mind background, that the thing that strikes me as the potential hubris of our whole enterprise is that there is a clear scientific rationale for being skeptical about our powers to know what's going on here. And that's, if you just take evolution as your starting point, there's no reason why apes like ourselves should know a damn thing about what's going on here, despite the fact that our science and the technology that it spawns is incredibly useful, and we seem to be playing a language game with ourselves, one that's augmented by the language of mathematics, that is producing less ignorance and more knowledge. I mean, it seems to be pushing back the frontier of something that is fundamentally bewildering. There's a mystery that we confront. We don't understand why we get sick. And then we discover viruses and bacteria, and there seems to be progress, right? But it's just, there is no reason to expect that the intuitions we rely on to do science should be fitted to reality in any deep way. Because if we look at our chimpanzee cousins, it's obvious not only do they not know a damn thing about what's going on, they couldn't possibly know a damn thing about what's going on. And we are just a slight iteration beyond them as a matter of apes having evolved. So where do you, as a scientist, get your confidence that the game you play as a physicist in particular is actually bringing you and other physicists into closer contact with
Yeah. Well, I mean, I share certainly a lot of that intuition. In fact, I had a TV show many years ago where it was on the first book I wrote, and there was one scene where I'm at a blackboard lecturing on the general theory of relativity, and clearly I'm lecturing to a student that's not quite getting it, and the camera slowly pans and it's a dog. And unfortunately, I got so many people, the response was they thought I was trying to say the audience was like the dog, which wasn't the point. The point was exactly the one that you're making, which is dogs are these intelligent creatures, but yet there's a limit to what they can understand. And we think that they don't understand, for instance, the general theory of relativity. And every time I say that, I always think maybe the dogs are out there, they think we don't understand general relativity. But assuming that's not the case, here we have a very good example of smart beings that are limited in what they can understand. So why is it that we aren't in the same boat? And presumably we are in the same boat. So I think that's a given, that we may be limited in what we can understand, but to the specifics of your question, why is it that we think we're making progress? It's very straightforward. We can sit down with the equations of quantum electrodynamics and calculate properties of electrons, their magnetic properties. The details don't really matter, but the calculation agrees with the measurement decimal by decimal by decimal 10 places after the decimal point.
Right.
That's enough. I'm done. I mean, think about that. That is an astonishing fact, that these strange gloppy things inside of our head can figure out the mathematics to understand the property of a particle to 1 part in a billion. And it agrees with the measurement. And at that point, you say to yourself, for some reason that we can't quite understand, mathematics provides this powerful illumination into the dark qualities of the universe and allows us to make progress on questions that don't seem to have any relevance to survival, right? But yet somehow the brain has gotten to the point where it can figure these things out. And I shouldn't even, it's not just they don't have relevance to survival. One imagines that back on the savannah, those of our forebears who got caught up thinking about black holes and quantum physics, they got eaten, right? So it's like not good for us to do this, but yet somehow we're able to.
Yeah, well, we have the last scene that we know about where that was almost certainly true was Archimedes in his bathtub.
Yeah, that's a curious one.
Making some more breakthrough in geometry, and then a Roman soldier just came in and impaled him. So, first rule of self-defense, you stop with the math when someone kicks down your door. So I just want to revisit some of the points you just made there, because so people have made, I've heard, I've been a consumer of skeptical utterances on this very topic. So I think there was one popular book on physics I read years ago. I think it was probably a John Gribben book, and it was. He said in there that there's a famous paper by Wigner, I believe, The Unreasonable Effectiveness of Mathematics in the Natural Sciences, or something close to that title.
Yeah, that's right.
And so it's been pitched as this mystery that mathematics seems to map onto reality in a way that is surprising and counterintuitive, and we're still just trying to make sense of that. But I think it was Gribben who wrote that actually the idea that mathematics that it's surprising that mathematics maps onto reality is a little bit like saying it's surprising that the English language is so good for writing plays in. Right, that there's this is the thing we're using, and we're finding ways to fit it to the circumstance we're in. That is, it seems to me that there may be a serious disanalogy there, in that mathematics, unlike English, seems to make predictions about what should be so. I mean, the relationship between electricity and magnetism, say, which then can be tested and proven to be true, that the mathematics itself sort of shines a light in a direction we weren't necessarily looking.
Right.
Is that valid, but is there more to it than that?
I don't think there's more to it than that, but that's a breathtaking quality, right? I mean, the fact that you use English to articulate thoughts and describe situations, sure, that's the mode that we have developed for that kind of communication. But mathematics is not a natural language, right? Mathematics is a way that we have found of encapsulating pattern in the world, but yet when we have identified the pattern, we can then use it to go far beyond the context in which it was developed. So, Einstein is thinking about space and time and the special theory of relativity in 1905, 1906, 1907. Then he takes this mathematics off the shelf in about 1912, a body of mathematics called Riemannian geometry that was largely developed in an abstract realm of mathematics to describe curved shapes, the kind of thing that the idle mathematical mind might find interesting, but not because we were trying to describe the external world. He takes that mathematics, is able to work with it into this generalized version of relativity, the general theory of relativity, and then make predictions about how stars in the distant night sky should look when their light traverses near the sun. And the way that those positions of the stars shift is then borne out by photographs taken 4 years later during a solar eclipse when the stars become visible. Yeah. That's the craziness, right? He wasn't trying to describe the motion and the position shifting of those stars, and yet he was able to make a statement about something that he had never received any data on, and it agreed with subsequent measurements.
Right.
That's the part that is absolutely thrilling.
Well, so there are physicists and mathematicians that have a quasi-mystical, quasi-Platonic notion about the significance of all this. So what's your explanation, if you have one, for why math seems to reach into the darker corners of reality for us?
I sort of look at it two ways, and it kind of depends on how a given day is going, you know, when you're doing the calculations. I mean, sometimes it feels like you're just sort of chipping away at the stone, revealing the beautiful sculpture, as if it's already out there, and all you're doing is revealing it. Other days when it's not going so well, it just feels like you're desperately trying to invent the ideas in order to be able to make progress. So I kind of go back and forth between the two, I have to say. I don't have a consistent view of the role of mathematics in this regard. And I would even say there are times when I have, I don't know if worried is the right word, but I've imagined the possibility that one day we make contact with an alien civilization and they say, hey, show us what you guys have figured out. And we bring out the textbooks with all of our beautiful equations, and they kind of look at it and they go, math.
They put you in a video where you're the dog.
Yeah, right. They basically, yeah, exactly. You know, they basically say, you know, we tried that for a while. It's kind of a dead end, guys. It'll take you just so far.
Yeah.
But then the funny thing is, if I try to imagine what they would replace it with, I can't even think of what they would replace it with that isn't in some sense mathematics, perhaps in an unrecognizable form or an unfamiliar form, perhaps a better way of saying it, because if math is a language of pattern, what are we doing? We're all just trying to encapsulate patterns. So whatever language you use to do that, maybe that is what math ultimately should be described as, and therefore will always be back to this kind of structure.
Right. There's another physicist who I've spoken with on my podcast a couple of times, David Deutsch, who I know you know. Forgive me, David, I've forgotten the reason why you believe this, but I believe he thinks that we are, in principle, we as math-using, language-forming cognitive systems are not cognitively closed to anything that could be known, given, I mean, I think it has, in his mind, something to do with a deep result around information theory and the universality of computation. I mean, but I don't think I can represent his view faithfully here. But the net result is he thinks that the notion that we could meet an alien intelligence or build a super intelligent computer that we couldn't understand on some level, that where we would stand as the dog in relation to that super intelligent system, he thinks that's a false fear or just in principle impossible. Do you have any reason to feel that? Or?
I mean, I have to understand more fully exactly what he's saying, but I mean, clearly, if you take our very species and you just, you know, wind the clock back however far you want to go, 30,000 years, 50,000 years, 70,000 years, I mean, there would be a cognitive mismatch relative to where we are today.
Yeah.
So it's certainly the case that given enough time, we can get to the point, obviously here we are, but I could certainly imagine that we encounter an alien intelligence and they are exponentially beyond anything that we have understood, and therefore we would be like ants.
Yeah.
And in fact, I think that's a good possibility as to why they're not paying attention to us.
Well, I think that's part of his argument, yeah. Actually, that takes me exactly where I want to go, but I think that is part of his argument that we're, given enough time or given enough augmentation of ourselves, we could fuse our cognitive horizon with anything else that we could meet. But on that point, where the hell is everybody?
Yeah.
Maybe you can remind people what the Fermi problem is, and then tell us what you...
Yeah, and Enrico Fermi, great physicist, is credited with, it's usually framed as the Fermi Paradox, I guess, which is, look, there's so many stars out there, so many, in fact, now we know for a fact that there are so many planetary systems out there, therefore you expect there's a lot of life out there. Where are they? Why haven't they come and visited us? It's sort of a quick way of describing the question. And, but yeah, I think it's an interesting thought to contemplate. I think there are many, many explanations for why they haven't come here. It could be, like I was saying, we're just not interesting enough, right? I mean, how many times do we stop on the street and have conversations with bacteria, right? So if we're bacteria, they're like, let's wait, a billion years, and maybe at that point we'll pay some attention. But there are other explanations too. I mean, maybe life is rare, right? I mean, we always have this idea in mind, I think, that at this point life is commonplace. Well, we don't know that. Or maybe life is commonplace, but intelligent life is rare, right? I mean, if that asteroid hadn't smashed into us 65 million years ago, who knows? Maybe it's still dinosaurs walking around and they're not building radio telescopes and sending out spaceships. The other possibilities are legion. I mean, the universe now, 92 billion light years across, the observable universe in terms of the things that we've had calls of contact with. We have traveled 1.5 light seconds from Earth. We have sent out probes that have gone out, 5 or 6 light hours.
Right.
So to say, why aren't they here? The universe is a big place. And it's not so easy to travel over large distances if you're constrained by the barrier of the speed of light.
So what's our furthest impact on the universe? Just bad television from 70 years ago? Is that?
Yeah. So if you take I guess TV, radio signals. Go back to say the 1900s. So maybe generously 150 light years if you allow any transmission that we sent out there. So 150 light years compared to 92 billion light years, right? That's not much.
Although the intuition is that if you look at the fact that we have gone from barely walking upright to sending out our own space probes in a very short period of time, so 300 years of practical science, really.
Yeah.
And if you think of so I guess the one assumption you need is that there's nothing really special about Earth. And more it seems that even 10 years ago, Earth seemed more special than it does now. Now we're finding planets every day that are seemingly in some kind of Goldilocks zone with respect to their star. And so if you don't think the conditions on Earth are so special, that they're really a dime a dozen out there in the galaxy and in other galaxies, and then you think we're talking about a time window of any place where life gets going and it gets complex is very likely it could be millions of years on either side of us. Anything that's complex that could build a civilization, that is very unlikely to have happened in the last 300 years. They might as well have 300 years plus 10 million years to have gotten that going, right? So then you would expect just the galaxy to be awash in something that we could detect, right? That has been going on for millions of years. I guess the one additional wrinkle that we haven't mentioned is that there could just be something about building a complex civilization, building technology that is lethal to species like ourselves.
Absolutely. It could be that we're
showing every sign of it being dangerous.
Right, exactly. I mean, it could be that once you get to the point where you're able to undertake these kind of grand space journeys, you're in a very dangerous situation, and typically you don't survive. There are more optimistic ways of explaining it, though, too. So maybe the universe is teeming with all this activity. It's just not in the wavelengths that we're looking. We're just not sensitive to it, right? Maybe the time scales over which the vibrations of whatever medium that they're using are incredibly long or incredibly short. So we just hear it as like noise in the background and don't recognize that there's a signal, or we don't even have any sensitivity to it at all.
Right.
So I think
their bad television is coming at a different frequency?
It could well be. Right, so I don't consider it a paradox. I think it's an interesting point of departure in trying to understand whether we're special, whether life is special, whether intelligence is special. But I mean, from your perspective, right? Let's say life is commonplace. The journey from life to intelligence is non-trivial. Do you think that is as straightforward as you might assume in order to come to the conclusion that there should be all sorts of intelligence out there?
Well, looking at Earth, you wouldn't draw that conclusion. I mean,
Why?
Even
Why do you say that? How many species are there on this planet?
Well, no, I'm saying, I think I'm agreeing with you.
Oh, good.
Yeah,
okay.
that it's. Yeah. No, I mean, the truth is, it's non-trivial even if you look at our own species.
Yes, that's the point. Good, yeah.
If you murdered the top, if you took, so how many people on Earth at this moment deeply understand the science required to build intelligent machines, right? So if they all caught a bad virus and died off, how long would it take just the people left to reinvent the computer, right? That's a non-trivial problem for most of us. I mean, if you leave me alone on a desert island with the necessary elements, you're not going to get an iPhone anytime soon. So that, I mean, in some sense, we're all living on the shoulders of, if not giants, on the shoulders of legacy institutions and ways of doing things that it would be very hard for anyone to recapitulate. I mean, even any group of especially talented, qualified people, you forget how to go, mine the ore that you need to make that circuit, right?
And that's even assuming the existence of us humans already. I mean, if you just get rid of that whole particular branch, then you don't even have anything heading in that direction.
Yeah. So it strikes me as incredibly tenuous and fragile, right? And by no means guaranteed to keep happening. Because again, I mean, the thing that's interesting is that it doesn't. What we're using to do everything that makes us human is not obviously better from a Darwinian perspective as a matter of survival. I mean, because again, in the long run, we could wind up killing ourselves. And there are many things that have persisted as themselves, as discrete species for tens of millions of years. You take something like a lobster, right? Now, lobsters are just doing their lobster thing year after year after year, and they seem to be fine unless we wind up eating too many of them or destroying their environment. There's something quite a bit more precarious about our place in the world, and so it's not even just as on purely Darwinian grounds. It's not like this surfeit of intelligence and abstract thought is clearly something that evolution is an attractor that evolution will keep finding because it's just so good for a matter of survival.
Right. No, I agree. And I think that's a very natural explanation, not the most optimistic of ones, but certainly is an explanation.
Well, I'm rarely accused of optimism, so. He optimistically asks, what worries you at this moment in human history? When you look at how we as a species think about reality and how to live within it, what do you, you and I don't know each other well at all. I don't know, do you pay attention to things in the culture even relevant to your science? Like, is the fact that nuclear proliferation, the prospect of nuclear war, either by design or by accident, the fact that it's almost not talked about at all now, and yet every moment of our lives we've been living under this same sword of Damocles. Is that something that you spend time thinking about? Or
No.
No? No. Well, no. It's an honest answer if true. But are you not part of any meetings of physicists that worry about that?
Yeah, it's facetious.
But the truth is, I mean, the horror is that it's actually true
Right.
for most of us. I mean, like we have gone to sleep on this issue.
Well, I would say that is a reasonable description of me. I mean, obviously, we all are aware of these issues. I think about these issues. I don't, from a day-to-day perspective, worry about these issues, nor from a day-to-day perspective do I work on these issues. It could well be that we have lulled ourselves into a state of complacency by virtue of nothing, catastrophic, happening yesterday or the day before. I do, walk around the world with an optimistic sensibility.
Yeah.
That we will find ways to deal with these issues, but that can be a masquerade for an unfortunate complacency at the same time.
So what are if you could list the problems that you felt we needed to address, if we could get our priorities straight, what's near the top of your list in terms of?
Well, the obvious ones that we would all, I think, put there, we can rattle them off. You started with nuclear proliferation, issues of clean energy, issues of environmental catastrophe, ones, that we just, we were briefly touching upon, when we had dinner just a couple hours ago. Issues of, AI, which I would even frame in a somewhat more general paradigm, which is, I don't think we're very good at having the intuition about exponential growth.
Yeah.
It's just not something that we're really good at. I mean, everybody, this is a self-selected audience, but anybody who has never heard of, the standard example where, you get a penny on the first day and 2 pennies on the second and 4 on the third, and so, anybody who hasn't heard that before and learns that by the end of the month you've got $1 billion plus, they're like, what? Everybody here knows that, but everybody who's not seen that before, it's very surprising. So I think the scariest things are those which have an exponential growth, and we're not paying attention to them sufficiently early, and we get whacked by the exponential growth of some quality of the world that needs our attention, and we didn't give it attention early enough in the process. And I think, AI is a possibility along those lines.
So you take the notion of an intelligence explosion or some kind of singularity, some kind of breakaway of AI. You take that seriously?
I would say I take it seriously. It's not something that I fear. I don't deeply fear it. And again, I question my own self about that. Should I be fearing it more? And if I ask myself why I don't, it's because I think fundamentally, I think that the people who are responsible for the innovation that, for instance, may yield, an intelligence that at some point may far outstrip us, it feels to me that the people leading the charge on that are fundamentally good people. I know these people. Some of the, I just feel that they're good people and that ultimately they will pay attention to the safety issues that need to be thought through. Now,
this
you
is
could
on
say
their, on their 12th Red Bull?
It could be. It could be. We have examples in the past where we thought doomsday was upon us. Nuclear weapons. I mean, there are moments where it looked like we were at the precipice, and we have found a way to survive. And I guess that has given me an optimistic sensibility. It's been challenged. November 8, 2016, it was challenged. It continues to be challenged. But I think fundamentally I'm still in the same place.
Right. Well, you're a New Yorker. You'll be fine, right? Yeah. Well, so I will not take the orange bait there. But to speak generically about politics and kind of culture war issues. So I think you and I take a different line here. So I've spent a lot of time arguing specifically about there being a kind of zero-sum contest between religion and science, right? Or believing things for good reasons and believing things for bad reasons, or flip that around.
Yeah.
And you haven't. I think you've been loath to pit them against one another in a way that will reliably turn people off to science. If you tell people that they can't have their resurrection and their cosmology too, a significant number of Americans will say, well, okay, fuck your cosmology. I'll stick with Jesus. Obviously you're not alone in that. But so, like, one, do you acknowledge that that's a difference between the way we have kind of played the game intellectually?
I think so.
Yeah.
It'd be good to, if that's something you want, we probably should, expand on that somewhat. But I think that's the case. And my feeling from the outside, watching, and I don't even mean to put you in this group because this may not be accurate, but I've certainly seen certain members of the science community going out into the world in a way that I consider ineffective,
right,
toward their own stated goal, and that feels irrational to me. To go out into the world and tell people that you're stupid for certain kinds of beliefs strikes me as not the best strategy, right? I mean, the strategy that I feel works is to go out into the world with a passion and enthusiasm for the things that you think are good to understand and important to understand and point in a valuable direction, and to hope that the energy and the momentum from those kinds of conversations will drive things in a good direction. I've never felt the need to go out into the world and slap down other things.
Right.
That's not how I want to spend my time, and I've never found that an effective approach.
Yeah, well, I totally understand that. I think there are some, so having taken the other line, and now I have I have a fair amount of experience with this. I can tell you that there are a few myths here that could be and perhaps should be retired. One is the idea that it simply never works, right? That you can never reason someone out of something they weren't reasoned into. So someone was born to a faith, they've had it drummed into them by their parents, they're now massively attached to it emotionally.
Yeah.
They get to adulthood, it's still the most important thing in their life. They've taught their children to believe likewise. You can't reason that person out of these sets of convictions. That's just untrue, because I hear from these people all the time who have watched some debate or watched some video, no matter how offensive at first glance. They're susceptible to just seeing the bad evidence and the bad arguments that have been propping up their faith, these many millennia.
But not to interrupt, let me just quickly say that I agree with the capacity to shift people's attitudes, perspectives, beliefs.
Right.
Because I've had those experiences too, but I've done it a different way. And when I've gotten people coming up to me or writing me emails saying, now that I understand the fundamental workings of the universe a little bit better and understand the cosmology that the other person might have pushed off, but now that I have an understanding of what modern science is saying about these things, I just find it thrilling, and the other things that used to find gratifying no longer are working for me. Well, so I've seen that too.
Right, no, but that's you're talking about the carrot, and I'm still talking about the stick on some.
Yes, I agree.
So, but
totally get it.
I'm saying the stick also works.
But I guess what I'd say to you is, if the stick works and the carrot works, first, I think they're probably working on different people. Let's put that to the side for the moment. Which would you rather use?
I found you can only hit someone so hard with a carrot.
Well, and I found you don't need to hit them at all.
Well, but I should just say, so for instance, just to kind of prep you for your, I think Travis just announced that you're doing an event with Dawkins, right?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, so I'm preparing you for your
Thank you, appreciate it. Much appreciated, but I've had conversations in a public setting with them before, but that's okay. Yeah. Please come.
No, but I heard his, I heard him over my shoulder when you were talking about the generic offensive atheist who wasn't necessarily me. It might have been Richard. But I'm just saying, I'm sure he's sitting on tens of thousands of emails from people who
Sure.
can honestly say, you know, though I thought you were an offensive bastard at the beginning, you actually argued me out of my most cherished beliefs. So that, I'm just saying, as a matter of sociology, that happens, right?
Yeah, sure.
Now, but yet it's counterintuitive. We all know that there is this phenomenon. I mean, it's actually been now studied up to a point. This notion of a backfire effect, where when you challenge people's beliefs, and even when you provide them with counter evidence to those beliefs, there's some part of the human nervous system that just doubles down in the face of counter evidence, and they leave this confrontation believing what they believe even more ardently than they did in the first place. So that happens, but I guess in part it's a matter of taste. It's certainly a matter of just how you want to spend your time. I completely get that you don't want to be the guy who's just the go-to guy for, you know, why you can't have your cake and eat it too in the matter of science versus religion. But have you ever found yourself on specific issues where to take one, so we were just talking about the environment and, you know, and the prospect of nuclear war. There are religious ideas that seemingly perfectly inoculate people against viewing those as problems. There's no degree to which we could despoil the environment, and there's no threat of nuclear cataclysm so salient that could get a fundamentalist Christian, say, who's waiting for Jesus to return and hurl sinners into a lake of fire, to really worry about those problems. Because on some level, those are the things that have to happen as precursors to the glorious end of the world. I mean, it's you just, as a matter of biblical prophecy, you can just connect the dots, and things really do have to go to hell in a handbasket in order for the best thing that's ever going to happen to finally happen. So those are all the signs and wonders that they're waiting to see, right? So if you find yourself in the presence of that kind of dogmatism, where the worse things get, really the better they're getting,
right? Because
Jesus is going to come back and solve all our problems. Don't you feel don't you feel like an intellectual and or ethical responsibility as a scientist to push hard on those specific beliefs that stand in the way of thinking rationally about those problems?
Yeah, it's a good question. In fact, it's one that I have had that conversation with Richard. And we came to an interesting point, which is I'm rarely confronted with the situation that you describe. And we suspect, at least it emerged from our conversation, because there's more of a focus, if you will, on the biological sciences as the place where a fundamentalist religious perspective will look for a point of confrontation.
Yeah, with evolution,
Yeah, than with, somebody who's talking about vibrating strings and extra dimensions and the kind of abstract science that I focus my research attention on. So I'm not in that situation. I'm rarely. In fact, I don't think I'm ever in that situation. And that may, if I were, on a regular basis, I'll come along with you. I'll shadow you and
take you to a couple of parties.
Yeah, right, exactly.
Well, so back to your areas of controversy in your world. So as a consumer of physics from the outside, it seems like many people are worried that that physics as a discipline has been more or less moribund for a generation. That you have string theory that this is like the most celebrated thing or was the most celebrated thing at a certain point, but everyone was sort of just waiting around for it to deliver the goods, and it hasn't yet. And you have a whole generation of physicists that got absorbed by this what was a kind of intellectual fashion in theoretical physics, which may not have panned out and may never pan out. Now, these are the echoes of disgruntled graduate students that one hears. What's your view of the state of physics?
Yeah, I think what you're describing is something that the press has picked up on in various times, and it certainly has echoed in a certain way throughout the public and throughout the press and so on. But the fact of the matter is that physics is theoretical physics is in a very healthy state, in that there are a lot of great ideas and there's a lot of substantial progress. And when one says that a theory like string theory has not delivered the goods, it feels odd for me to hear that. I understand where you're coming from, but it strikes me that it's coming from a place where you've not been within the field sufficiently deep to really see the progress that has been made. I mean, the theory on paper puts together gravity and quantum mechanics. The fundamental theoretical problem of 20th century physics, in principle, has the solution within string theory. Is it the right solution? We don't know, but that's great progress.
But then why is it controversial? Why isn't everyone a string theorist if that marriage has been consummated?
They're just not good enough. No, it's
get out on Twitter. We want to spread this around.
The answer to that question, and please don't tweet. That was just a joke. The answer to that question is that it's extraordinarily difficult to test any theory that puts gravity and quantum mechanics together.
Right.
Extraordinarily difficult because we don't have the technological feasibility to test a theory in the domains where it differentiates itself from conventional theories. And this is not just an issue that faces string theory. Any theory that puts gravity and quantum mechanics together is going to face this dilemma. So if we were able to build an accelerator as big as the galaxy, then we'd be able to test these ideas. That's tough to do in this funding environment, you know. So that's really the issue. The issue is that on paper, there are features of the theory that are enormously attractive, but we can't test them. Moreover, theorists like myself will also point out the theory itself has gone into some directions that raise questions, interesting questions. A theory that predicts other universes as a possible intrinsic quality of the theory, you got to take a step back and ask yourself, does that make logical sense? Is that a theory that we're willing to take seriously? And, you know, after studying these questions intently for a long period of time, my answer is that, yes, these are worthy of our attention, that these theories may be taking us into the right direction. Do we know that they're right? No. The only thing that will ever establish that they're correct and end the controversy would be to make a prediction and we go out and measure it. And that is the gold standard, and that's something that we've not been able to achieve. The theory is in many ways in its early stages, even 30, 40 years later. These are difficult questions. So that's the answer, why it's controversial. It's not made a testable prediction. But the theory continues to make substantial progress on understanding the nature of space and time, the nature of black holes. The theory's been able to embrace effectively all of the discoveries of the past. All of them naturally fit within the structure of string theory. You don't have to wipe out the past. It embraces the past. These qualities make the theory enormously attractive and compelling. Again, it's not yet been tested.
So it hasn't made any prediction analogous to the kinds that Einstein's relativity made, that were not a matter of having to build some apparatus with insane energies, but just, you know, looking up at the bending of starlight. Has there been anything like that with string theory that has?
Absolutely not. No. And that's, I mean, you know, it's funny that you bring that up. You know, I had a high school student many years ago who did a science talent search project, you know, this competition in the United States, where this woman calculated the corrections to the bending of starlight by the sun that come out of string theory. So that's what Einstein did, and maybe string theory modifies the prediction. And you know, it was a thought experiment. I roughly knew what the answer would be, and the answer that she got from calculation turned out to be about the same. It was about 1 part in like 10 to the 90.
Yeah, that's hard.
So you know, it's something that you're not going to be able to measure. It's too small.
Yeah, aren't there fewer?
10 to the 88. Yeah.
Yeah, fewer particles in the entire universe. Yes, right. Okay, yes. So you mentioned multiple universes. I think there are at least a few different ways in which there might be multiple universes.
Yeah.
But there is a many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics that I think to the alarm of most people who hear about this is very well subscribed among physicists. Right now, where do you come out? You might want to summarize why one would be tempted to believe in multiple universes.
Yeah.
But these are universes wherein, trillions upon trillions of nearly identical copies of ourselves are having nearly identical conversations, but with every different variation of what's possible. So essentially, everything that can possibly happen happens somewhere. So there's
if it's compatible with
the laws of physics. Yeah.
Right.
So there is a universe. If you subscribe to this theory, there is a universe in which we had this conversation, and then took our clothes off in the middle of it, right? For reasons that presumably made sense in that universe.
Wait, let me calculate. Not compatible with laws of physics.
Right, yes. Yes, this will not happen in this universe, rest assured. But this is actually believed, right? Now this on its face, to me, is the least believable thing on offer. Right?
Yeah.
And yet this is not only subscribed, but by someone, this is actually just plain vanilla quantum mechanics now.
I wouldn't go that far, no.
But I think
there's great controversy on this. I mean, David Deutsch, who you mentioned, is one of the proponents of this way of thinking about quantum mechanics, but I would not call it the vanilla interpretation of quantum mechanics.
But I think if you poll people at a physics conference, you get something like
changed.
30% or something that believe it.
I don't know if 30% I would call it vanilla, but it changes over time. And I first, maybe it's worth quickly saying what it is, and then I can give you my perspective on it. So quantum mechanics broke with the past by saying that whereas Newton in classical physics taught us that you can, given the state of the world now, predict how it will be 5 minutes later or a million years later using the equations of motion to evolve it forward in time, quantum theory came along and said that's the wrong way of thinking about things. If you know everything that you can know about the universe right now, the best you can do is predict the probability, the likelihood that you get one or another outcome when you run the equations forward an hour or 100 million years into the future. Now that sets up an interesting situation because, for instance, if the law says that there's a 50% chance that the electron is here and 50% chance that it's over here, right? When you go to measure the electron, you don't find sort of half of it here and half of it here. You always find one whole electron either here or here. So the question is, if you find the electron in my left hand, what happened to the possibility of it being in my right hand? Right. You might say, well, that just goes away. The problem is just goes away is incompatible with the mathematics. The most straightforward reading of the equation suggests, if you just use the most straightforward interpretation that's right there, the equation suggests that there's actually one universe where indeed you do find it in my left hand, and there's another universe where you find it in my right hand. And therefore, there's a copy of me in that universe with two hands, thinking that there's only one unique outcome, but there are two of me in distinct universes under that same illusion, that there's only one universe. But the God's eye view, if you don't mind me using that metaphor, is that there are many universes out there, and basically anything that's allowed by the laws of quantum physics is represented in this menagerie of universes. Now, if you ask me, do I subscribe to this way of thinking about quantum mechanics, my answer is no. And the reason is, I'm not saying that it's wrong, I'm saying that we're not at the point yet where we can answer that question. Because there's a gaping hole in the structure of quantum mechanics that maybe doesn't get enough airtime. Quantum mechanics, in my view, and many others, but this is not universal, is not a complete subject. We're missing a solution to the so-called quantum measurement problem, which simply is the question, when you measure the position of a particle like an electron, how do you go from this weird, fuzzy mixture of multiple possibilities? It's over here and it's over here, and there's some kind of fuzzy mixture of the two. How do you go from that fuzzy probabilistic description in the equations to the single definite reality that emerges when you actually undertake the observation?
Right.
How do you go from fuzziness to definite reality? And this is a question that we do not know the answer to. And since clearly in thinking about where the possibilities go, the act of measurement or observation is intrinsic to the very question that we're talking about, until we answer that question, we can't really come to a conclusion on what the right way of thinking about quantum mechanics is.
Do you think we're far enough along that we can conclude that there is no answer that goes down easily with respect to our intuitions?
No.
That any answer is going to seem crazy?
No, I don't think so.
Okay.
There's a version of quantum mechanics that's sort of the dark horse version of the theory, due to somebody named David Bohm.
Yeah.
Also, Louis de Broglie had the same idea a couple decades earlier. And this version of quantum mechanics that's virtually never taught, never spoken about in public,
Right.
has the quality that particles still go along trajectories, right? The new idea of quantum mechanics is, in the traditional way that one talks about it, is particles don't move on trajectories. It's just those nebulous waves that are evolving in some weird quantum space called Hilbert space, not even the space that we live in. That's the reality that's being described by the equations. But David Bohm came along and said, no, there's a version of this theory in which particles still go along definite trajectories.
Right.
And that's closer to our intuition about how the world works. So if this way of thinking about quantum mechanics were to bear fruit, if that's the right way of doing it, it will be somewhat closer to our intuition than the version that we currently talk about.
Well, remind me, what do you I still recall you have to sacrifice something that we're attached to as a matter of common sense with Bohm. You have to sacrifice locality, right? I mean, it's a non-local.
That's right. So it has the weird property that, you do something over here, and it affects something over here instantaneously.
Yeah, and over here it can be in Andromeda.
It could be in the other side of the universe. Now, you say, as you rightly do, we're giving something up, and therefore that suggests that there are other versions of quantum mechanics where you don't have to give that up. But the fact of the matter is, even in the most straightforward version of quantum mechanics that we teach to our students all the time, there is a non-local quality already. It's called entanglement.
Yeah.
It's the Einstein-Podolsky-Rosen contribution in 1935, which showed that if you have a particle over here and a particle over here, you do a measurement over here, measurement, right? So again, this unknown quality called quantum measurement comes into the story. But you do a measurement over here, and it affects the particle over here. This is what Einstein called spooky. Spooky action at a distance. You do something here, and it affects something over there. But that's within the standard formulation of quantum mechanics as well. In this Bohmian version, it's made more explicit. It's more in your face. Right? It's right there in the math. You don't have to do analysis to find it. But in a sense, you're not giving something up because you've already given it up with quantum mechanics.
Right. Now, it's very fashionable in New Age circles to find solace in one interpretation of quantum mechanics, which is usually described as the Copenhagen interpretation, which privileges this measurement moment of the role of consciousness in determining the nature of reality. And Einstein famously said, do you really think that the moon doesn't exist unless I'm looking at it as a way of disparaging this view? My sense from talking to physicists of late is that interpretations of QM that privilege the role of consciousness are less and less fashionable to the point of being more or less retired now. Is that actually where it is? And what do you think about consciousness as a part of this puzzle?
Well, it's a very hard question because you can't ever get out of your head, right? I mean, if you imagine a measurement being undertaken not by a conscious being, but by a computer or some mechanical device, you'd say, well, there's no conscious quality involved, and therefore consciousness can't play a role in the process. You still need to go over and look at the device to see whether it's accomplished what you set it out to do. So it's very hard to ever get outside of the framework in which a conscious being is brought in at some point in the quantum mechanical story. And that's what makes it hard to excise it fully. However, having said that, there's no reason that we can possibly see where consciousness plays a fundamental role in the quantum unfolding. right? I mean, you write down the basic equations, and they apply to individual particles, and whether those individual particles are grouped together in some amorphous mass or into this nicely organized structure that allows some kind of internal processing to take place, it doesn't seem to matter to the equations. That's an add-on, and therefore it doesn't seem that consciousness is vital to the story. So I don't think so. I don't think consciousness is essential. And I would just underscore one point. We talk about interpretations of quantum mechanics as if quantum mechanics exists, and we're just sort of sitting back trying to say, what do we make of it? That's not the situation.
Yeah.
These so-called different interpretations are attempting to resolve this unsolved problem of quantum measurement. And that's a real issue. And therefore, it can well be the case that these aren't just different interpretations, they're different theories. And if we understand them well enough, when we finally have a solution to the measurement problem, we might find that it's not that we were struggling with interpretations, we were struggling with actually giving birth to the full theory itself. And I suspect that that's where things will ultimately turn out.
Right, right. Well, I know we have to go to questions soon. I just have one more question I want to ask you before we do, but perhaps if that needs to be prepared at any, with mics, we should do that. But what is the status of the concept of time in physics now? I mean, most of us know that space and time got married with Einstein, and so we speak of space-time as opposed to time on its own. But I mean, time is both space and time are intuitions we have. I mean, they're kind of, our nervous system is sectioning reality in such a way as to naturally produce these concepts for us. And there's every reason to believe now, it sounds like that our common sense about space and time is not, in fact, what they are as a matter of physical reality. But there are concepts in physics, like the concept of a block universe, right, that suggests that we're radically at odds with what reality is. That under some construal, the future exists just as much as the present, and as does the past. And so, what can you give us a kind of a potted view of what time is from the point of view of physics today? Yes, and as a matter of time, you have 2 minutes.
So, before Einstein came on the scene, everybody had the intuitive notion of time, and that was the very notion of time that was in the equations of physics that Newton gave us. And when Einstein came along, he shattered that perspective, first in 1905, I think as many are familiar, by showing that objects in motion will find that their clocks do not tick off time at the same rate.
Right.
That's crazy, right? We used to think there is a time that we're all relentlessly moving forward within, second after second, and if you're in relative motion, your clocks won't tick off time at the same rate. That's crazy. Then,
and that's been also experimentally established. That's not just a matter of the theory. We've sent clocks around the world in airplanes, and our GPS relies on taking that into account and all of that.
Absolutely right. We've got particles and accelerators that are living much longer than they would if they were sitting on a table because their clock is ticking off time more slowly. Right. So this is beyond doubt. Then 1915, Einstein gives us general relativity, and we learn that it's not just motion that affects the passage of time, it's also gravity affects the passage of time. So if you're near a strong gravitational source, time will tick off far more slowly than it is if you're far away from that gravitational source, that gravitational potential. Again, that's kind of a crazy idea, right? You hang out near the edge of a black hole and time for you elapses more slowly than for somebody who is far away. Now, these are all giving us insights into strange and unexpected features about the nature of time and also space, which is melded together, as you indicated. But the deeper question is the one that you asked toward the end, which is time and space, are these fundamental structures in reality, or do we impose them on reality in order to organize our inner perception? And it's a very hard question. I don't know the answer to it, but I will say this. One of the features of string theory in the last few years, some really remarkable work, has gone a really giant step forward towards showing that space and time may not be fundamental structures. They may emerge from more basic ingredients that naturally arise in string theory. So, emergence, of course, is a familiar idea in many subjects. We all know what temperature means. We know when things are hot, when they're cold, but then you dig deeper and we know that temperature actually is a reflection of how quickly molecules and atoms are moving. Something's hot when the average motion is fast, something's cold when the average motion is slower. So that gives us a deeper understanding of what temperature is in terms of more fundamental entities.
Yeah.
We've now taken a step toward that kind of progression for space and time. There's work in string theory that shows that space may actually be stitched together by the threads of the quantum entanglement that we were describing before, that non-local quality of quantum mechanics. We've been able to do calculations within string theory, in essence, where we're able to cut the threads that are keeping the fabric of space together. Nothing to worry about, it's just mathematics. But we cut these threads and we're able to see that what remains are sort of isolated points that no longer stitch together in the manner of our familiar conception of what space is. So this, to me, is probably the next revolution. If you ask me what the next revolution is, it's going to be a way of thinking about physics in which space and time are not put in at the get-go into the equations, but rather emerge later on when certain environmental conditions are met, and when they are met, space and time as we intuitively know them will emerge. But when those conditions are not met, there can be realms of the universe in which there is no conventional notion of space and no conventional notion of time.
Right. Well, unfortunately, on this stage, there's a very conventional notion of time. So we would love to get your questions, and we'd love the house lights to change so that we can see some of you. Right. We will just go left and right here. We'll start over here. Thank you. Yeah. And just to remind everybody, questions often end in a high rising tone. So if you can achieve that, you're good. Thank you.
I just want to say thank you for the talk. I found it very interesting, and thank you to you both for coming to Toronto.
Oh,
I think my
Thank you.
my question kind of loosely relates to kind of what you guys talked about in the beginning. And there was a scientist, Sam, you talked about, who you said you don't know why he came to this conclusion, but there was no
David
way.
Deutsch, yeah.
There's no way to conceivably think of AI or an alien species that humans can't comprehend. My question kind of loosely relates to that, and I kind of have to preface it with a quick explanation of experiments, how I think about it in my head. I don't really know what the experiment's called, but it's like the red dot experiment, where a scientist would put a red dot on different animals' forehead and put a mirror in front of them.
Self-recognition.
And kind of rank their level of intelligence or their level of capacity of consciousness.
Yeah.
And I was wondering if maybe both of you have an opinion on this, whether humans kind of have an analogous kind of red dot point where there becomes a problem or an issue where just our biology or our capacity of knowledge or consciousness, we might look at the answer of the problem right in the face and just not be able to see it. Like, it's right there, but we just can't comprehend it within our... So I guess for both of you kind of is appropriate because, Sam, your primary concern is consciousness and level of thought. And Brian, I assume that you and your colleagues are probably going to be at the forefront butting heads with these problems. So I guess my question is, do you guys think that there's a limit, or can humans just continually expand basically forever?
Yeah, well, it's an interesting analogy that I haven't really thought of before. But so just to remind you all of what that is. There's this mirror self-recognition test that has been done on various species of animals, and most species, no matter how smart they appear in other ways, if you put them in front of a mirror, they don't warm up to the realization that that's them in the glass. They relate to that other species as that image as another member of their species. And embarrassment ensues. But there are certain species that very few that can gradually recognize that based on their own movements that the dot is on their heads, and I think we are. It's very easy to see personally. I mean, I think it's easy to see that one as an individual has certain limitations, certain things to which one is cognitively and emotionally and just dispositionally closed, right? And certain games you can't play, or you certainly can't play under any kind of time horizon that make it pragmatic for you to attempt to play those games, right? So, like, if you put in a room with the Martians for long, like, how long does the conversation have to go on to fully explore your cognitive limits? Well, for many of us, not all that long, right? And then the question is how, but my sense is that, well, this is another question I could ask you too that fits in here. If you could nominate one member of our species, past or present, who just as a brain that would be best suited to explore the limits of human cognitive horizons in the presence of superintelligent aliens, who would you put in that room to just say, okay, this is humanity, this is the best we've got in terms of dialogue with this species?
I don't know, Justin Bieber. I don't know, and I think part of the answer to that question.
But let me just give you a candidate. So it's either John von Neumann or it's Isaac Newton. You can give them all the modern understanding. Just a brain to just put there.
I guess I would be uncomfortable because they're really smart at certain things.
Yeah.
But, like, why not Shakespeare or Freud? I mean, there's just so many different ways of engaging reality.
I can tell you why not Freud, but
what's that? Yeah. I stopped myself halfway through. Yeah. But interesting. You knew where I was going with it. Yeah. I think intelligence comes in a wide variety of different forms. And it could be, as you're suggesting, that the answer's right in front of us and we don't see it. I suspect that's a real possibility. But I'll give you one data point. And I'm not sure how relevant it is, but at least it gives me some sense of optimism. When I was a graduate student a long time ago, it seemed like the amount of material that you needed to learn in order to even begin to do your research for the degree, the doctoral degree, was like incredible, right? I mean, so how are you going to study all this and then have time left to do the project, but yet somehow we're able to do it? And now, 35 years later, whatever it is, with all of the progress that's been made, I mean, the kids that come into string theory, they have to learn everything that I had to learn back then, and they have to learn the past 35 years of it too, and yet they still have to be done in the same number of years. Yeah. And somehow they're able to do it. So it feels to me that...
They still have Instagram accounts to tend to.
That's the amazing thing. And Fortnite, they still play Fortnite, So it strikes me that there's some way that we're able to adapt to the ever greater volume of information and knowledge that we need in order to make progress. So I guess what I'm saying is the fact that we've not hit that wall gives me hope that we're pretty good. We're pretty flexible. But could it be, logically speaking, that there is a wall and all that we're looking for is just an inch beyond that wall and we can't quite see through it? Yeah.
That was kind of more what I was, not necessarily an individual single human that represents the best, but more like, 200 years ago in terms of evolutionary time, we're pretty much the same, but drastically different. Like, will that just continue? Will we eventually be the green-headed aliens coming down with super magical technology, or will we get to a point where the
Well,
entire
as long as we
species
keep going. I mean, I think
Yeah.
the leverage is
Can we keep
culture.
going?
I mean, we keep porting all the gains into culture, and then there's a kind of a chunking. I mean, this explains how each new wave of graduate students can kind of recapitulate the history of intellectual progress in physics in their own lifetime, and know more about physics than Einstein did, and then keep going. Anyway, interesting question over here.
You're probably both aware of Niels Bohr's position. Physics is to be regarded not so much as the study of something a priori given, but rather as the development of methods of ordering and surveying human experience. So it's less finding the photon that's actually there and more making sense of those lines as a picture of an old woman or a young woman.
Yeah.
What's your take on Bohr's position?
Well, I think we actually, in deference to time, I'll say we sort of covered that in talking about the Copenhagen interpretation of physics. I mean, he was the originator of that interpretation, and the sense at that point when quantum mechanics was first being born, there was a very strong sense that the universe was more mind-like than matter-like based on that view of things. And feel free to correct me if I'm wrong here, but I feel like the conversation at the very least has widened and moved on, and we're not quite there with Bohr's take on it.
Yeah, the one thing I would add to that is, Bohr had a view of the world which is aligning with what you're saying, is ultimately science is about explaining observations and data. It's not about peeling back the curtain and seeing the fundamental reality. And I think Bohr was forced into that position by virtue of the fact that he couldn't peel back the curtain. And quantum mechanics was working, and yet he was unable to tell us what it was telling us about the true nature of reality. So he said, don't worry about the true nature of reality. That's not what physics is about. And I think it's a very limited way of looking at science. I'm not so interested in being able to only predict the results of experiments. I like that. That's the gold standard. But in the end of the day, when I'm on my deathbed, I hope that I have some deeper understanding of what's reality, of what's behind that curtain. And if all that we're doing is being better able at predicting results of experiments to further decimal places down the line, I'd rather be doing something else.
Over here.
Hi, thank you both for coming. My question is for Sam. Earlier in the talk, you asked Dr. Greene about what issues keep him up at night. And aside from nuclear proliferation, I was wondering if you could share with us your answer for the same.
Well, largely it is kind of the meta issue of our reliable failure to make sense to one another and have conversations that productively, that lead to the solution of problems in any kind of direct way. So the fact that we have political systems that can't function over a long time horizon. We've got this 4-year election cycle presidentially to worry about, and therefore it's impossible to have a 40-year plan about anything, right? And we have problems whose time horizon is long or longish, and we have problems that are global in nature. So by definition, we can't solve these individually as nation states, and we can't solve these by fixating on the incentives of a 4-year election cycle. And in the midst of all that, we have a level of polarization, whether it's political or it's ideological across the board. It's religious. There are many things that contaminate our conversation with one another, which make it virtually impossible to make sense long enough and productively enough to get all of us to converge on, even to recognize what the problems are, much less how to solve them. So I just think that conversation is all we have, successful conversation is all we have to solve our problems together. And so when I see it just break down not only frequently and catastrophically, but reliably so. It's like you can just guarantee that the conversation is going to be ineffectual, given where most people are most of the time. That's what worries me, and that's kind of the meta problem that subsumes all the others, whether it's climate change or nuclear war, proliferation, or how do we deal with emerging pandemics or the prospect thereof. Why can't we decide to make more antibiotics when we know we're running out of them? We just can't agree how to create systems that incentivize things we know we want to do or should know we want to do, because we can't even talk coherently enough about these things. So,
Thank you.
Yeah, over here. Thank you.
Hi.
Hey.
So Sam's opening question for Dr. Greene was, what is it that gives you optimism about that one can make progress, I guess, intellectually? And your answer was that we can prove the outcomes, or we can predict the outcomes of experiments. The most recent question, you actually said if that's all we're doing, you'd rather find something else to do. And during your talk, you said that the quantum measurement problem is the gaping hole in the the theory of quantum theories, or theory of quantum mechanics, and makes it almost impossible to choose between those that emerge. And so it seems that there's no path to a place where the thing that gives you confidence that we can make progress, no path exists to that state. Do you retain confidence in the endeavor?
I've never quite thought of it that way, and I'm kind of devastated. So a few things. First off, when I talk about what gives me confidence in the approach that we're following, it's the fact that we have a powerful diagnostic that tells us whether we're going in the right direction. That diagnostic is not the final reason we do what we do, but that diagnostic is, can you make a prediction? Can you test it with an observation or an experiment? And I love it as a diagnostic. I don't love it as the end game. And that's the difference between the two. Now, in terms of the quantum measurement problem itself, it's a very curious state of affairs, because we have an algorithm called a quantum algorithm that allows us to make predictions for the result of an experiment, even though the intermediate step, we don't understand how the universe makes that intermediate step, and that's the hole that I was describing earlier. But nevertheless, the algorithm works, and that's borne out by the agreement between prediction and observation. So it's not as though we're fully at sea and the boat's about to tip. We are incredibly on course, but there are vital pieces of the story that we've yet to figure out. Now, I should say, there are other physicists who would be up here and saying there is no quantum measurement problem. I mean, my good friend, Anton Zeilinger, this is a brilliant man who doesn't just do quantum physics calculations, he actually does the experiments. So this is like the real deal, not like someone just spouts off about these ideas. He actually does the stuff. And when I sit with him and talk with him, he kind of has an avuncular attitude toward me. He says, hey, you can worry about those kind of things if you want to, but you're wasting your time because there's no problem, Brian. And so that's his perspective. It works. We have an algorithm, and we can make predictions, and end of story. So it's just to say that there are different attitudes as to whether this is an issue, because I think there are different goals that we have as scientists. As we were saying to the earlier question, some of us just want to be able to predict, some of us want to be able to enlighten. And whether that latter goal is misguided, I don't know. I don't think it is, but some in the field certainly do.
Thanks.
Hello, my name's Brendan. I'm an intern on some of the dark matter experiments at Snow Lab, and I have a question for Brian. I was curious, seeing the results from many recent dark matter experiments that have searched larger energy spaces and are possibly indicating it may not exist, and that brings into question some of the predictions of supersymmetry. So I was wondering, what do you think the plan B is if that doesn't work out?
Well, just 30 seconds on the background, and everybody I think knows that since the 1930s there's been increasing evidence that there should be more stuff out there than we see, dark stuff, because we need something to give rise to an additional gravitational tug responsible for the motions of stars and galaxies that we observe. So for a long time now, we've been trying to go out and find this dark stuff. We assume that it's raining down on Earth. We don't see it, but we build detectors in hopes that we will.
Can you spell out what dark means in this context?
Dark solely means that it doesn't give off light.
Right.
And that's really all that it is. So it's many of the proposals involve particles that, as the questioner asked, some of them are exotic species of particles that come out of theories like string theory or more generally supersymmetry. And we had hoped, and the hope is not dead, that these experiments would capture one of these dark particles, particles that don't give off light, that don't interact with the electromagnetic force. That's
right.
a more precise way of saying it. But we've come up empty-handed for a long time. So what's the answer to this? There are a number of answers. Number one, it could be that we just got to keep on looking and we'll find it. I think that's the bread and butter answer that many people still have. More exotic answer is that perhaps there is no dark matter at all, and maybe it's our understanding of the force of gravity that needs to be modified. And that's why things are moving in a way that doesn't comport with our previous understanding of gravity, and that motivated the introduction of this new stuff to make up the difference, but maybe it's gravity that's not doing what we think it should be doing. And a third possibility, which is an elaboration of that, is there are exotic ideas that have emerged from string theory, so-called holographic ideas. It'd be a bit involved to explain it in any detail, but some of those ideas suggest that there's no need for dark matter at all, that the natural solution to the mismatch between observation and prediction is resolved in these more exotic approaches to understanding the force of gravity. So those are 2.5, roughly 3 possible plan Bs.
Thank you very much.
Hi there, I'm Vlad, and this question is for Sam, but I'd love to hear Brian's thoughts as well. Sam, you see our efforts to make moral progress as us navigating a landscape of possible states of consciousness, and the way to navigate that space is through science. I would generally agree with this, but I think that there are certain categories of navigation problems to which science cannot provide an objective answer due to the fact that there are many types of beneficial mental states that are qualitatively different from each other and not readily comparable. So, for example, loving another person, or the joy of working to create something, or mindfulness, helping others, etc.
Right.
And it may be the case that achieving a peak in one area, let's say intense meditation or mindfulness, may necessitate suffering in another area, let's say the love that comes from close personal relationships. So my question is, how can we ever determine which is more important? How can science help us navigate when realizing one beneficial conscious state is in conflict with realizing another beneficial but qualitatively different conscious state?
And you want me to weigh in on this too?
Yeah, that'd be great.
Yeah. You can say as much as I said about dark matter. So there's a couple of intuitions there that I would just want to push on. One is the idea that not being able to answer those questions is a problem for the claim that there is an answer to those questions. So this is, in my book, The Moral Landscape, I differentiated answers in practice from answers in principle. We know there are many facts of the matter for which there are answers in principle, and trivially easy answers in principle, just integer-based answers. Like how many grains of sand are there on Earth, right? As long as we define grain of sand clearly enough, that is an integer answer. And yet we know we'll never have access to that information, and it probably just changed anyway, right? So, or even simpler, how many, the example I've often used is, how many birds are in flight over the surface of the Earth at this moment, right? Well, It just changed, and we know we're never going to get the data. So, but there was an answer to that question. There are other kinds of questions where there are no clear answers, but there are ranges of answers. There's kind of a blurry, haze around the right answer, and some of these are just norms of just how we run society. It's like, well, what's the right age to give someone a driver's license? Well, when I was 15 and a half, I thought 16 was probably a little too late. Now when I drive and I look over and I see a 16-year-old behind the wheel of a 4,000-pound automobile, I think that looks insane to me, right? So self-driving cars can't come soon enough. But what's the right answer? Well, given all things considered, it's an all things considered situation where we know we can never do this perfectly. We know that some 16-year-olds are really not up to it, but we have to draw the line somewhere. Wherever we draw the line, it's going to be arbitrary. 16 is arbitrary, 16 and a half is arbitrary, 18 would be arbitrary. And yet we know there are wrong answers. We know that 6 months is definitely the wrong answer, right? So if you shift the window of consideration there, so you're not capturing anything we care about. If you move it to 16, well, if we moved it to 25, fewer people would die. There's no question, right? But we have other concerns beyond body count. We have, mothers and fathers who are just sick of driving their kids to school every day, right? So what's that worth? And we play around with this, and we know we're never going to do the math sufficiently so that we know down to our toes that we've got it perfectly right? But it doesn't mean that there aren't better and worse answers in that space. We know there are worse answers. 6 months just gets you absolutely nowhere, and 100 also doesn't work, right? So the answer is somewhere along this continuum, and for many things in life, we have to be satisfied with that. Now, I think we will be less and less satisfied the more we can get our hands on really good data, and the more our technology allows us to use that data in ways. And I think this will be surprising. So this is true in medicine in many ways. It's like when there's nothing to do about a condition, right? There is no cure. There's no understanding of its basic biology, and yet people are suffering mightily. It's like polio, right? People it used to be a common feature of life, even in the most affluent areas, that people would be hobbled and killed by polio, right? Now we've lost sight of that horror because we have a vaccine for polio, and have had it, for as long as most of us have been alive. Now, preventing polio is a trivially easy thing to do, and if you decided, the people who are against vaccines across the board, or so worried about the possibility that they have some other downside, or who are kind of preventing their kids from getting vaccinated, in a very local area, it may not cause a problem for them or the people around them, but if enough people do it, we'll be back to the days of polio, right? And that is clearly no place worth going, right? And it becomes, you move from an environment in which you have this devastating thing for which there's nothing to do, and you just got to sort of pray it doesn't happen to you, to it's a trivially easy solve, and you're irresponsible if you don't do it, right? And those, we will continually be buffeted around by those kinds of changes based on knowledge and changes in technology. But my main resistance to the question is the idea that a lack of answers in practice means that there are no answers in principle, and that a blurry boundary around the right answer means that the difference between better and worse, and even much, much better and much, much worse, goes out the window. I think we still have that, no matter how dimly we understand our situation on any of these things. So, yeah, I hope that made sense.
Let me just
yeah, go for it.
Again, the only thought that occurs to me, and I may not be fully appreciating the nuance of the question, so apologies, but one of the things that we certainly teach to our students, standard physics issue with students is it's critical to pose a well-formed question. And a well-formed research question is one that's not overdetermined, not underdetermined, but it's one that has an answer. And that's a very hard step to get to properly frame a question so that there is a procedure by which an answer can emerge, because the system is not underdetermined, it's not overdetermined, it's not self-contradictory, and there is a unique answer to be found. And the issues that you're describing are ones that typically are underdetermined. So I'm a little bit confused when you say, the answer is somewhere between here and here. What do you mean by the answer?
Well,
it's an underdetermined question.
In this case, what should be the driving age?
No, I understand the question, but it's an underdetermined question. There is no right answer to it based on it's not a well-posed question. I mean, you can make decisions, like you say, and various people will come up with different propositions for what the good policy should be, but there is no the answer in the sense that there is an electron magnetic moment, right? There is a the answer in that situation because it's a question that's posed in a specific way.
But there is a gradient.
A gradient.
And if you go far enough in one direction,
absolutely,
you can feel yourself getting colder.
Totally got that.
And then you go back warmer.
Totally got it.
So,
but that doesn't mean that there is a the answer.
Yeah. No. So in those cases, any answer within a certain boundary may just seem arbitrary because it will be arbitrary. You can't specify the right answer.
I agreed.
Yeah. Okay. But
Thanks.
Hi, my name's Daniel. I was wondering if I could get both of your thoughts on the role of the social stigma, the societal stigma against being wrong, the role that plays in political, philosophical, and even scientific discourse, and assuming that role is negative and substantial, what can we do on both a personal and societal level to mitigate and combat that stigma?
Yeah, good question. I would add to that, and I'll pitch it to you first. There's a stigma around saying you don't know something, and there's a asymmetry here. So in science, there's very little stigma around this. In fact, scientists defensively say they don't know all the time, so as not to embarrass themselves in front of people who know more than they do at a conference. So, but if you put a scientist on television and get him or her talking about global warming or whatever it is, and they start issuing the responsible scientific caveats about, well, we're not, I'm not an expert on this, or I don't know that. Yeah. That doesn't translate well into popular journalistic consumption of information. And if you put that person up against some Bible-thumping blowhard who knows everything, they lose. So
totally get it. Yeah. And that's why there is not a single video of me, and I say this with 100% confidence, because I have never been on television talking about something that I did not feel expert in.
Right.
I'm not interested. I get all sorts of calls to talk about things like the climate and features of that sort, and I don't do it. Why? For exactly the reason that you're saying. I am comfortable saying I don't know, but that's not the place to be saying it.
Right.
So to your question, it is the case, as Sam is saying, that we recognize, certainly as theoretical physicists, that most of what we do in our life will be wrong. Not because we made a mistake. Sometimes we will make a mistake. That's the hard time when that happens. But it'll be wrong in the sense that it will be irrelevant. Nature won't take any interest in the direction that our research took us, so whatever we published will just rot away in some journal someplace. And that's true for the vast majority of what we will do. And to be a theoretical physicist, to come to terms with that early on. And so we're very comfortable with being wrong in that sense. And I think that's a very valuable lesson. And it is a good one to have. And it does allow us freedom. Because we're not constantly worried, well, if I go that direction, I'll be wrong. No, we just go.
And that allows us to have unexpected eureka moments that change everything. But that's as a community. The individual will go down many blind alleys, and that's just how it is.
Well, how do you experience this larger phenomenon, which is related, of people having a kind of confirmation bias and a sunk cost bias that keeps them wedded to a theory that is almost certainly wrong, or for which there's good evidence to believe that they wouldn't come to it that way now, and it absorbs decades or at least years of their time.
I've never seen that happen.
Right. So, but what's often celebrated in science is that happens less in science than anywhere else. Like in science, you win points even for proving yourself wrong, or for disavowing the thing that made you famous last decade, because there's now new data.
Well, hopefully you're the one that finds the problem with it.
Yeah.
But I think we have confidence that we're part of a community that's incredibly skeptical, that's always investigating itself. Any idea that's put forward, the rest of the community takes a sledgehammer and starts to smash on it, trying to break it. And so we feel confident that if it doesn't break, it's worthy. It's worthy of further attention and further study. So from that perspective, it's so rare for an idea to sort of hang out there, and the community says it's okay and tries to smash it, they can't smash it, and it's completely irrelevant, completely wrong, we've all been deluded. It's such a rare phenomenon. So I believe it's really the fact that we're part of this community that's self-policing. It doesn't need something from the outside to come in and pass judgment. It's an internal self-correcting mechanism that allows it to make progress.
Yeah.
My name's Mike. Hi, Brian and Sam. I'm very appreciative that you guys are here and very thankful that we had such a privilege to hear you talk about such high-level topics.
Well, thanks for coming.
I have a question that pertains in part to both of you, and you'll each have your own area of expertise to maybe give some input on it. You didn't really get to talking about different interpretations of, like, for example, the many worlds theory that you talked about. I know that, Brian, you talk a lot about brain theory and that, spatially distributed universes where there could be copies of us, potentially. So the part for you would be, which is the horse you're betting on in terms of if we were to ever be able to maybe prove that, whether it's the many worlds interpretation or through brain theory, that we could indeed prove that there are copies of ourselves or multiple universes, and one day prove this fact. And then if we could, to Sam, would that be enough fodder to write QED on the blackboard and say that all religious dogma kind of goes out the window, since we would have infinite Jesus Christ and infinite deities in each of these universes, and there can only be one true one according to the dogma. So would that maybe be enough that you could just slam it on the table and walk out?
Unfortunately, in some of those universes, there are, well, this brings us to the other thing we didn't talk about, the simulation argument, the idea that we might be living in a simulation. And the concern there is that we could be living in a simulation run by, the Mormons of the future, where Mormonism is true in this simulation. And there's a similar problem in the many worlds interpretation, which is, correct me if I'm wrong, but if absolutely everything compatible with the laws of physics happens in these universes, isn't there some construal of quantum mechanics where Jesus is physically resurrected and that's not incompatible with? There's some quantum spookiness that allows for things like a physical resurrection.
Yeah,
right?
you don't even need to go to quantum mechanics in that incarnation, in that version.
Everybody get ready with Twitter, because what's about to come out is going to be good.
Yeah. So one of the puzzles of modern cosmology is that if we allow inflationary cosmology, which is the bread and butter version of the theory that people are talking about, if that's the right way of thinking about the universe, then ours would just be one of many universes, be many big bangs in many realms out there. And what that entails, in principle, is that if we wait long enough in a given universe, random particle motion, just random particle motion in a given universe, will coalesce into any physically realizable structure.
Right.
So
you can just get Jesus appearing, or Jesus or Kim Kardashian just appearing out of the
That's exactly right. And I'm not joking about that. So we call it the Boltzmann brain problem after Ludwig Boltzmann, who died this day in 1906. And he was the first person to really think about the fact that our universe itself may not have originated from some process in the distant past, but the universe may have existed effectively for an eternity, and just the random particle motion at one weird moment happened to coalesce into a configuration that over time then evolved into everything that we are familiar with. And that is a rare fluctuation of the particles, but his point was, if you've got an eternity, rare things will happen.
And not only will happen, I mean, every rare thing is guaranteed to happen.
That's right. So then we take that one step further beyond what he said, which is effectively the point that you're making, which is in the far future, if the universe exists for an infinite amount of time into the far future, which these current theories suggest, then these random particle motions, sure, they could create another Big Bang, but it's even easier for them to create something less complex. Not a whole universe, but just create a brain floating in the void.
Right.
So it could be that in the far future, the particles come together and they create a thinking brain that sort of has some thoughts. And it might think that it's here having this conversation. And that brain may just exist for a second or two and disintegrates. But if the configuration of the particles is even more special, it'll last longer and longer. And if it's even more special still, it could think it's Jesus, it could be Jesus, or it could be Kim Kardashian, it could be any of these structures.
Right.
So yes, I'd rather you not tweet about it per se, because it has some nuance associated with it. But yeah, that would be in our future in these various ways of thinking about cosmology.
Right. But also not just in the future. If space were big enough, you just go far enough in one direction, you're going to hit all those possibilities.
Absolutely. So if space is infinitely big, which we don't know that it is, but again, in the most favored version of cosmology, that's a very natural outcome, that space is infinitely big. And there's an interesting thing that happens there, which is in any region, like our observable universe, the part that we can have interactions with, we have a lot of particles here. It's a number that you made reference to, 10 to the 80, 10 to the 88, some large number of particles in our universe. Quantum mechanics shows that there are only a finite number, a huge number, but there are only a finite number of configurations of those particles. Now, if space goes on infinitely far, imagine you have chunks of universe that are as big as ours, populated by particles, and you ask yourself, can the particle configuration in each chunk be different? Well, if it goes on infinitely far, and there are only finitely many distinct configurations, there aren't enough distinct configurations to go around. The particle configurations have to repeat. And if they have to repeat, that means that there's a version of us out there, and there's a version of effectively anything compatible laws of physics out there, and not just out there once, out there infinitely many times.
I think you just made me a Scientologist.
My work is done.
Thank you very much, guys.
Thanks.
Hey guys, great talk, appreciate it very much. All right, so I might be a bit atypical. I'm going to ask about animal rights. I guess Brian is into animal rights a bit. So my question is, what is it that's true of an animal that, if true of a human, would justify stabbing them to death for a hamburger? And if you can name such a property, something that, if true of humans, would justify doing this to them, would you be able to spell out the situation in which we do it to them without sounding completely psychopathic? Just to give a quick example, we'll not waste time. If you were to say intelligence, would it be okay to murder low intelligence people? If you were to say that it's the fact that it's natural, would it be, okay to murder humans if that were natural, etc.?
Right.
And I'll just say, when we went to dinner earlier,
he has the moral high ground based on dinner.
The vegan had to sit with 3 meat eaters eating these like big ass steaks. All right, so toss it to you.
Well, the amazing thing is I briefly considered what to order in light of having to face this moment, and then I said, fuck it.
Wasn't worth it.
That's right, yes. No, why make it easy on myself? Well, so there are many, so I'm basically a consequentialist, which means, I just think the cash value of a moral proposition is in the well-being of conscious creatures now or in the future, actual or possible, right? So I think there are things that should be captured, that can be captured by consequentialism thought all the way through that aren't normally captured by it. So for instance, when you ask, why is it, why can't we just kill, if we find people who have the characteristics of livestock, why can't we treat them exactly like livestock, right? So that's sort of a question you just asked. Well, given the nature of what we are as social primates, treating people exactly like livestock has a different consequence on us and on our culture and on our capacity to live with one another than treating livestock like livestock. So it's not precisely the same problem, right? So and that's why cannibalism, I mean, there's a taboo around cannibalism that makes sense. I guess there could be some world in which we throw off this taboo and that we don't pay the kinds of consequences many of us feel we might pay, right? So we could just, eat the dead because they're good protein, and we're not at all sentimental about their bodies once we know they're no longer have a basis for experience, right? But in this world, at this moment, given all the moving parts, if people start eating their parents when they die, we feel differently about them, right? And that begins to derange a lot of many other things we care about. So you have to take all the consequences in view. Now, I think that it's impossible to defend factory farming as it is. I mean, knowing the details. I think it's just, we want to solve that problem somehow, right? And yet, I happen to think that it's not at all obvious that we can all be vegans and be healthy, right? I mean, we were talking, to give the full picture, we were talking about the problem of being a parent and having vegan or vegetarian kids, right? Now, my view of that is that you're running a kind of science experiment on your kids, and it's not totally clear how it's going to come out, right? And when I've run that experiment on myself, it's, I became anemic the first time I was a vegetarian for 6 years. All kinds of things go sideways in my blood the last time I did this experiment for a year. Now, no doubt with more intelligence or more attention to the details, most people can solve those problems for themselves as a vegan or a vegetarian, but perhaps not everyone can, right? And I think there may be another solution. I mean, I'm hopeful that this clean meat revolution that is struggling to be born will be one solution. So there's a company, Memphis Meats, whose CEO I had on my podcast, where they have a meatball that they have engineered that does not entail the death of any animal. It entails the removal of a single cell from the right animal. They grow these cells in culture, and then you have, unfortunately now it's still an $18,000 meatball, but ultimately, if it could be brought to scale, it would be a meat industry that wouldn't entail the suffering and death of billions of animals. There's this, if you really are worried just about the experience of conscious creatures, there is a way of flipping this around. I have no illusions that this will convince you, a committed vegan or vegetarian, but you have to have an actual counter-argument if you stipulate what I want you to stipulate here. If it's possible to raise livestock under conditions where they're really living lives worth living, right? So that you can really have happy cows or happy ducks or chickens or pigs, which is to say it would be better for those animals to have been than to not have been. These are net positive lives. Well, then that's a world in which veganism is not actually the most compassionate solution. That would be a world in which bringing those billions of creatures into existence and giving them net positive lives would be better than not, if you think well-being aggregates in some way. If you have the intuition that having a world with 7 billion happy people is better than a world with 2 billion happy people, stipulating that happiness accrues in some sense, right? You can run that same experiment. Now, I'm not saying we're anywhere near there with respect to our current practices, and I would completely support every differentiation one wanted to make with respect to the ethics of treating animals well. But it's not given all of the moving parts, it's not a straightforward question of saying, well, obviously everyone should be vegan right now.
Well, I would just answer by saying, don't stab them for the hamburger.
Yeah,
Thanks, guys.
Yes, I mean that is one answer, but I think it's here.
Yeah, thanks to you both for coming. Sam, big fan on the podcast. My question is for you, actually, and it has to do with AI. And when I think about your podcast, you talk to so many very intelligent, intellectual people on a number of different topics. And I'm interested to know what you are most excited about. You talked about, the pessimism, related to human intelligence and what we are all aware of. And obviously AI is going to, really take us to the next level, be it from, the CRISPR perspective of, looking at all of the different research that's being done here at home or outwardly at, planetary exploration. But from a standpoint, just for all of us in the room, what are you most excited about in, the remaining years that you're here on Earth when you think about AI and the advancements and the potential that we have? What are you most excited about?
Well, I think it's the most important and amazing and necessary thing when you think about it going well, right? Like we have all of these problems for which intelligence across some threshold is the only solution, right? Whether it's, how to solve for certain diseases, or stabilize our economy, or understand climate well enough, or make various scientific breakthroughs that would give us great benefit. And to think of building systems that can play all of these games that we care about and are right to care about, and which protect everything else we care about, so much better than we can, that it's clear they need to do it. I mean, just when you look at what's happened with a very simple game like chess or Go, Alpha Zero. So we've been playing chess for, I don't know, what was it, something like 1,000 years, right? And you have the totality of human knowledge and ingenuity purposed on that very narrow task, where people have gotten just amazingly good at this, and people spend their whole lives getting, we have the smartest people spending their whole lives at this fairly simple task and getting as good as humanly possible. And then we build computer programs that have studied every game we have a record of, and they get as good as it seems they can possibly get on the basis of the totality of that knowledge, and they get a little bit better than people. And that's the situation that we had up until, Google came up with AlphaGo and then AlphaZero. And AlphaZero was a program that didn't have any chess knowledge in it, right? Didn't study all of humanity's record of genius with chess. It just played itself for 4 hours and then beat the best bespoke chess computer ever made, right? Or played it something like 100 games and to a draw 28 times and then beat it 72 other times. So you just imagine having that kind of breakthrough in every other area that we care about, whether it's solving mathematical theorems or protein folding problems and developing new drugs, everything, right? Intelligence is the only game in town when you want to solve problems, and there's no reason to think that it's not substrate independent, which is to say there's no reason to think that all the intelligence we care about, that there's every reason to think that intelligence across the board is just like chess. right? It's just like that. We now know that computers can be much better than we will ever be at chess or at Go. And there's every reason to think that everything else we're doing on the basis of information processing is just like that. I think that's an assumption, but I think it's a good assumption to make. And once you make that assumption, then you just see all of the ways in which we can solve problems we can't even dream of solving now. And that will be an amazing world to live in. It's also very interesting that if we get any significant piece of that wrong, we are just ushering in this just dystopian hellscape for ourselves, very likely, right? And there are all kinds of moral problems we need to solve because we need to build our values into these intelligent systems. We can't have, they have to be tethered to what we want and our own notion of our own well-being, and they have to be something that we can be in dialogue with, so as to refine our notion of what we want and what we should want in the future. I mean, that's the ultimate thing for me would be to have an intelligent system that would be a kind of oracle or a kind of genie, where you could be in dialogue with it and it could sort of map out for you sort of where you are in this part of the landscape of possible experience, and where it is you might find worth going based on what's possible for a brain like yours, and a brain like yours in perhaps very real mechanical dialogue or electromagnetic dialogue or pharmacological dialogue with a system more intelligent than yourself. So I think the life could get very, very strange and very, very wonderful. But again, there's like this tightrope walk into the strange and wonderful, and off the rope is just this plunge into weirdness, and that's not at all humanistic or even compatible with our basic sanity. So I think it's thrilling because it's a problem where science and moral philosophy totally intersect, right? Like, this is philosophy on a deadline, as somebody recently said. That might have been Nick Bostrom. And I think there's a lot of problems we have to get right, and even to think about this stuff. And it relates to the question that was just asked about the ethics of killing animals. I mean, we could live to see a time where there's just as poignant an ethical question about you turning off your computer. Are you committing a murder when you turn off a computer of sufficient sophistication, right? Or are we inadvertently building machines that can suffer? And that's a huge problem. So.
Hello, Sam. My question relates to your claim about our lack of free will. Given such postulate is true, how do we draw the line between the incompatible nature of free will with reality as we understand it versus our lack of free will and its irreconcilable nature with a functioning pragmatism? In other words, if the most evil man we can envision is simply a Darwinistic and/or environmental error who happened to inherit a concoction of variances which he did not choose, how do we finally calibrate our moral scruples on an obvious contradiction between well-being and responsibility? As an example, if we were to create a pill that could cure the next kid who would potentially be Charles Whitman, it seems a net positive for everyone in doing so. However, if we try to run the same logic with Hitler and Saddam Hussein post-atrocities, our moral edifice seems to fall right under our feet. Granted, such situations are anomalous, but I would argue the same logic can be applied at a lesser degree on most criminals. So I have two questions for you. Number one, could it be that...
What's amazing here is what you're doing now, people really often hate, but you're doing it so well that it's just fun. So just keep doing it. So ask your question.
I'm very nervous right now, which is why I'm trying to speak so fast.
No, it's great. Okay.
Number one, could it be that the pragmatic implications of a nonchalant happiest can be Hitler roaming around, jeopardize society, and therein overturn his lack of responsibility for having done so in the first place? And number two, where do you draw the boundary between our ethical commitment to curing the ill and the devastating repercussions their misapprehensions can cause on society?
Right. Okay. Well, that's a great question about the implications of dispensing with free will on our morality and on our politics and on our solving problems together. Well, so I don't know where, we haven't talked about this, but I don't know if free will makes as little sense to you as it does to me. I think free will is I think there's no way to think about the propagation of causes in this world that makes any deep sense of this notion of free will. And I think if we We understood ourselves. If you grant that, nobody picks their parents, nobody picks their genes, nobody picks the environmental influences to the system that's specified by genes and development.
Yeah, we're each a bag of particles governed by the laws of physics, and that's all there is to it.
Yeah, and even if you added, ectoplasm or immortal souls, nobody picks their souls, or soul.
Or even put quantum mechanics, the randomness of quantum mechanics is not what we mean by volitional choice.
Exactly, right. So we're sort of on the same page, it sounds like. So,
But we had to say that.
Yeah. And if you returned our brains to precisely the state they're in at this moment, we would make the noises that we're making in precisely the same way.
No.
Every time. Well, but adding randomness.
I do not agree with
randomness
that.
doesn't help.
Randomness doesn't help, but we wouldn't make the same noises. We would make different noises, but we couldn't choose what noises we would make,
Okay.
and that's very different.
Those noises would be dictated by the totality of influences to the system in that moment. Are you adding quantumness, or are you adding?
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
Yeah, so this whole idea of rerunning the tape and running it forward again does not yield the same progression, but it doesn't yield the progression that we have volitional choice of.
Right, got it, okay. So quantum mechanics
Just to
doesn't
make that clear.
Yeah, quantum mechanics doesn't get you the freedom you think you have either.
Exactly.
But you add this additional piece where we have these cases where someone does something heinous, like there was a case that I talked about with Robert Sapolsky on my podcast that it was in the news where some otherwise totally normal guy started getting really fixated on child pornography, right? So there was child pornography was found on his work computer or whatever. He got fired, and then he started doing all kinds of inappropriate things. And they discovered he had a brain tumor, and the judge in this case didn't find the brain tumor totally exculpatory for somebody. Like the judge sort of split the baby and put him in jail for 8 years when it could have been, for the rest of his life. And Robert and I both talked about what a bizarre miscarriage of justice that was. But it is an intuition that we all have that once you understand the causes of bad behavior clearly enough, once you find a brain tumor that's big enough and in just the right place, as was the case with Charles Whitman, who you referenced, that seems exculpatory. That seems like, okay, this person's just suffering bad luck. He's got a bad roll of the dice biologically. He's not the really evil person who deserves to be punished. My argument is that if you understood all of the causal connections that dictate our behavior, you would arrive at that same epiphany with respect to every evil thing that every person does. And what's more, if we had a cure for those causes, right? If there was a cure, right now there's no cure for psychopathy. We just have people who are psychopaths, evil people who are reliably doing terrible things because they're selfish and they don't feel the kind of empathy that most of us feel for the suffering of others. Then if we had something we could put in the water so as to just knock psychopathy just out of the theater of human events, we would do that, and we would then view psychopathy as a condition like diabetes, right? There's not much praise or blame associated with having it. It's just bad luck, right? Now, your concern is that I think that we need, we're in this sort of no man's land where we don't totally understand the basis of human behavior, and what's more, we don't have remedies for people being bad.
Right. My thing is, I understand your case with Charles Whitman and say maybe
right.
a 13-year-old.
But with Hitler, it's hard,
exactly.
right? And I would grant you that there are, on some level, we do just want to do what works, right? And there's the question is the question of whether to punish bad people isn't a question about free will. It's not saying they could do otherwise. The question is, and then therefore it's not a question of them really deserving to be punished once you catch them, because they really are bad. The question is, what are the effects of punishment? And in many cases, the effects are what we want them to be, right? Punishment, certain kinds of punishments reliably dissuade people from doing bad things when they're dissuadable. Now, some people are not dissuadable, right? And some punishments are so out of register with the thing we're trying to prevent, that they derange something else about our society. I mean, if we can't make, if it was a matter of capital punishment for, cutting into line at the bank, right? Well, then, no one would ever cut into line, but, we would live in a horrific society, right? And there's some societies that kind of approximate that. I mean, so, there are authoritarian societies like Singapore where they seem to cane you or kill you for just about anything, right? And it's very orderly, right? And so, like, there are people who will talk about the upside of killing people for marijuana possession because it works so damn well in Singapore. Now, I don't think they have it, the dial tuned to quite the right spot there, but again, it comes down to what sort of world you want to live in. And I think, but I think this conversation is only going to be going in one direction. It's not like we're going to learn less and less about ourselves, right? And the more and more we learn about ourselves, it's going to fill in the blank spaces on the map in a reliable way, and it'll be in a way that makes things look like there's no deep agency, there's no deep responsibility, and there's no bright line between when someone becomes the victim of circumstance. The example I often use is, Saddam Hussein, when he's 40 years old, is a scary bastard who just deserves to be hung, right? Because he's made enough people suffer. He has this coming to him. But you roll back the clock in his life, well, he's 18, well, he's still pretty scary and, probably deserves to be hung, right? But when he's 4, he is just the unlucky boy who has bad genes and bad parents and a bad society, who is destined to become Saddam Hussein on some level, right? And the more we learn about ourselves is going to make the kind of the timeline look more and more like the boy's timeline, and less like the scary man's timeline. That's what I would argue, but that I guess remains to be
Brian
seen.
and Sam, we got a minute to finish up here. If you guys have any final thoughts for the evening.
Okay, so sorry, we just got to the end of the voice of God tells us that we're time is real. Do you have any closing point that you want to make?
No, I'm good.
Good.
Awesome.
All right, everyone, please give a big round of applause to Brian Greene and Sam Harris.
Thank you so much.
All right, everyone, thank you all so much for coming. We'll be back soon. Let art and science inspire. Good night. Thank you.